welcome to today's episode of the Take two. Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Group Therapy Podcast. Today we have Lovecraft scholar and historian S T Joshi. You may know that a couple weeks ago we got to do an interview with Mr. Pasha about the documentary Ex Jesus Lovecraft, and because of that, I searched out Mr. Joshi, and I've been waiting with bated breath for this interview, sir. And tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm not a young man, so I've been around. And I got started early. In fact, I first read Lovecraft when I was like a teenager, as a lot of people
Yeah.
do. And I think it's a great time to find him. Not because he's like, some childish interest of people, but I think when you're a teenager, ages of 14, 15, you're looking for something to kind of get you out of yourself and expand your imagination. And God knows Lovecraft does that.
Oh yeah.
But even at the very beginning, I said, this guy himself is of such interest to me. I mean, maybe because I felt some vague parallels to him. He was kind of shy and otherworldly, and so was I. And he kind of looked to the past, and even at that tender age, I did too. I don't think I liked the present, and still don't. In fact, I like it less now than I did then. I want to live in the past the way Lovecraft wanted to, and other things like that. Even things like love of cats, and which I adore. I just got two new cats, and they're wonderful. So what I realized was that I would have to get to Brown University to really study Lovecraft, because that's where a lot of his papers are. They were given to the library after his death in 1937. It's an enormous collection, and I was lucky to get in. Did all this incredible research there over the 6 years that I was there for getting a bachelor's and master's degrees, and I've used that knowledge ever since, and edited his texts, his fiction, his essays, his letters. His complete letters have now been published in 25 volumes. I wrote a biography, and I've done all this other stuff, and I think I've helped to promote Lovecraft both in the U.S. and around the world. I'm in touch with all kinds of editors and publishers around the world who wanted to publish translations of Lovecraft stuff, and I said, sure, go ahead. If I can help you, I'll do that, and it's just an ongoing process.
You were talking about being a kid and discovering Lovecraft, and I was talking with a good buddy of mine, and I was like, it was about junior high. I don't have the original book, but I do have another copy of it. This was the first Lovecraft book I ever found. Not the original one I found. This is one I've gotten much later. The Horror in the Museum. And it just sort of snowballed. I was a fan of Conan and stuff as a kid, and you're kind of like adjacent with Conan.
Mhm.
And I became fascinated with it. Like what you said. He talks about being an outsider and being different and stuff like that. And as a kid, you can really, really, especially when you're going through your teenage years, you feel like an outsider. You feel like you don't belong there, and it goes from there. And I didn't find out about more of the unsavory things until I got later into my high school years, when I started like picking up anything Lovecraft. So I picked up one of his volumes of letters, and then you're like, oh, okay, oh, all right. But you, we've talked about this ad nauseum about how you can separate the artist from the art, and you guys really delve deep into that in the documentary about being able to separate the man from the art, and about how he did grow as he went along, and especially towards the very end, a lot of people like in the documentary, you said that there's a lot of people believe that, oh, he got the bad news and then he suddenly changed who he was, but that wasn't the case. He had started changing who he was before he found out he had cancer, and not a lot of people know that. So
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest. I don't think Lovecraft suddenly reformed,
no,
on
no,
the issue of race, for example. But
yeah,
what he did over the last 6 or 7 years of his life was he became really engaged in politics and economics. I mean, understandably, because he lived through the early years of the Great Depression. I mean, how can you not address that? And he went from being a real a political conservative to being basically a moderate socialist. I mean, he would love Bernie Sanders today. My God,
Hmm.
what a shift that was! But it was all done, through thinking and observing. That was just not some irrational, move that had no basis. He was aware of what was going on. I mean, Lovecraft pretended he was an outsider living in the 18th century, but no, he knew he was living in the 20th century, and he was well aware of all the things that were going on in the world. And he said, "Look, capitalism's a failure. Let's be honest with it. We have to change," and that's how he became a socialist. The race thing did get moderated a bit. There was a famous anecdote a friend of Lovecraft's told that some woman, a neighbor of his, in fact, had gone back to Germany for a visit. I'm not sure of the details anyway. And she came back. This was 1936, and she came back with these horrible stories of what Hitler was doing to the Jews and other people. And Lovecraft was horrified. He said, "No, that's dreadful. We can't have that kind of thing happening." I mean, he may have still have retained prejudice, but he didn't want to hurt people. I mean, he was always polite and cordial to anyone he met because he believed in the values of a gentleman. I mean, that sounds classist or elitist or whatever,
Yeah.
but these, I think those are good things to have. It's a good attitude to have, and I wish more people had it. So he was always polite and cordial to anyone he met because that's how you behaved if you were a gentleman.
Yeah. So, how did you come to Mr. Pasha's project? How did you guys come together to work on that project?
Well, yeah, I don't know what he said to you, but it's he's lives in the Toronto area, and initially his interest, he'd gone through film school up there
Hmm.
with a bunch of other people, and obviously also became interested in Lovecraft because he felt this bond to Lovecraft. Being a Pakistani living in Canada, he obviously felt to be as an outsider, and Lovecraft was kind of a lifeline to him in some weird way. But of course, then he learned that Lovecraft had visited Quebec on three different occasions in the 1930s. And so his first idea was, let me just do a documentary about Lovecraft and Quebec. And I think he got some funding from the Canadian government. They're very good at that sort of thing. We are not here,
Nope.
certainly not now. And so initially that was just the core of his project. And so he got in touch with me, because he knew that I'd done all this biographical work. Had me fly up to Quebec. This was several years ago. This was before COVID, I think just before COVID, 2019, I think it was. So we spent a weekend in Quebec. Unfortunately, pouring rain most of the time, but that's all right. And we went around a lot of the sites that Lovecraft visited in Quebec. But then, as he started thinking about it, he wanted to expand this thing more and more to make it a full-fledged documentary. And I myself said, "Look, there have been a couple of other documentaries done, and they're pretty good. Let's focus on the places that Lovecraft lived in and wrote about in his stories because that has not really been done." So then again, after COVID, we took a second trip that covered, New York City and Providence and various places in Massachusetts, including, the area of the Quabbin Reservoir, which he wrote about in The Color Out of Space. And we filmed a lot of this stuff that had really never been filmed before. And I actually wish more of that had gotten into the documentary, but there's a matter of space, and he
Oh, yeah.
wanted other viewpoints, which is fine. But that to me is the essence of this documentary. How Lovecraft responded to places. I think he said himself that I am more responsive to places than to people, which is fine. That's just his attitude. And places inspired him a lot more than people did. And living in these various places, whether it be Providence or New York, really fired up his imagination, and that was the basis of his whole weird fiction.
Yeah, because a lot of people, believe that basically he was Providence. That's it. He may have traveled to New York briefly, here a couple, but he traveled quite a bit in a very short amount of time, and people don't realize that.
Oh God, he he
Yeah.
he's still traveled more than I have in many ways. I mean, he went up and down the East Coast, all the way from Quebec to the north, to Key West in Florida, and Richmond and Charleston and Philadelphia and D.C. and all these other places. I mean, very and on an extremely low budget. I mean, this guy had like no money. It's you know, he would spend whole nights on buses to avoid, you know, staying in a hotel or whatever. He you know, he got every bit of you know, travel he could out of the very small amount of money he had, and saw an enormous amount, and it really fed his imagination. You know, those New York years are very interesting. You know, he went to New York in 1924 to 26, you know, kind of married hastily, I'm sorry to
Yeah.
say. Uh, Marry in haste, repent in leisure, and that's exactly what happened to Lovecraft. And New York was a horrible experience for him because it was just too big and too chaotic, and God knows I know what that's like. I lived in the New York City area for 17 years, and it's a hellish place to be, especially if you don't have money,
Yeah.
which he didn't. Uh, but something about that whole experience, I don't know, affected his imagination so that when he finally got back to Providence, you know, without his wife, he just exploded. That's when he wrote The Call of Cthulhu and The Color of Space and The Case of Charles X. Ward and all these incredible stories that we know from the last 10 years of his life. So something about New York, fired up that imagination and made his work much more cosmic than it had been before.
Yeah. Because going into pre New York was mostly really short stories, your little one offs. And then
Mhm.
after New York, that's when he started the novellas and the longer form and stuff that we got away from in the early years. And, and that whole a very prolific amount of work was done in a very short amount of time. And people think that, oh, he was writing, Call of Cthulhu at the same time he was writing, you know, The Outsider, it's, but no, it wasn't. It was like these stories and then this big epic where he started getting grandiose. I guess not grandiose, but getting larger cosmically and getting, and a lot of people aren't aware of that. And
Well, it's the other thing is that, you know, he, you know, he was never a professional writer, and he didn't want to be a professional writer. He actually wrote very little in terms of fiction. I mean, in terms of total quantity over a career that really spanned only about 20 years, he wrote fiction that can be comfortably, included in like 3 volumes. Basically, Poe wrote about it as much, maybe even a little less. Very few writers have attained that kind of celebrity and critical esteem on such a relatively small body of work. You know, it took him a long time to get things down on paper because it had to filter through his imagination sometimes for years. I mean, for example, when he first visited Vermont in like 1927, went back in 28, I think. But it was 2 or 3 years later, until in 1930, that he finally could sort of process all the information or images and impressions of Vermont to write The Whisperer in Darkness. And let's also remember, in those last 10 years of his life, sometimes he would write only one story. It was a great story. Dunwich Horror, 1928, Whisperer in 1930, At the Mouths of Madness, and The Shadow over Innsmouth in 1931. That's 2 great stories in
oh,
1 year. That's something of a record, things like that. I mean, that's what I'm saying about not being a professional. As a pulp writer, you can't survive that way.
no,
They only paid a penny a word, and he didn't live on his writing. I mean, he had a little inheritance from his grandfather. It was kind of dwindling by the end of his life. He worked on what he called revision, which was just basically kind of sprucing up other people's works, not fiction for the most part. I mean, he did some of that, but mostly it was in like textbooks and poetry and other really bad stuff. But and he charged very little for that too. But that was basically his living. If he had tried to actually make a living from fiction, he'd be starving. I mean, basically starving. He was starving
I
anyway
was starving.
because
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah.
he had so little money. He said, I think I can get by on $15 a week, and that included his rent, which was $10 a week. Therefore, his actual income for food was like basically $3 a week, and $2 for expenses. I mean, you could barely get by in the 1930s on that kind of income. You could go to a restaurant and have a full meal for a quarter. Can't do that anymore.
No.
But he just barely managed to get by without starving to death.
Yeah. Well, that was during the time when he did was it the work for Houdini under the pyramid.
Hmm.
And where do you stand on that? Do you believe that he pretty much wrote that completely with just a little bit of input,
Oh
or
yeah, Lovecraft. Yeah, there's documentary evidence. I don't, let me see if he actually met Houdini before writing the story. I can't remember. But this was actually just before he was just as he was moving to New York in
Yeah.
the fall, winter or spring of 1924, because Weird Tales was in bad shape at the time. It had been out for about a year, and it was losing money, and they had to do something to kind of spur up sales. And Houdini was, a famous guy at the time.
Hmm.
So through the owner of Weird Tales, uh, this story that Houdini had gone to Egypt and got lost in the underground cavern of some pyramid or other, got to Lovecraft, and Lovecraft, who actually knew quite a lot about Egypt, he looked up some reference works in his own library and said, Houdini. He didn't put it this way, but he said, Houdini, you're full of shit. Uh, this is totally false. I mean, he says so. This is completely false. There's no way this could have happened. So he told the publisher of Weird Tales, let me just use my imagination. I'll use Houdini as the narrator of the story, first person narrator, but let me just go off and write my own story. And the guy said, yeah, sure, go ahead. The autograph, the handwritten manuscript of this story is still out there. In fact, it was being sold for some obscene amount of money by a book dealer. I can't remember if it's still for sale. Somebody actually bought it, but it's out there. It's all handwritten draft by Lovecraft. I think the input of Houdini was like, a fraction of 1%, let's say.
He's like, my name's Harry, my stage name's Harry Houdini, and this is the name of the story, and that's where it probably ended.
Yeah, well, and the funny thing is that the publisher somehow didn't expect Lovecraft to write a first person narrative as if he were Houdini, because initially he wanted to put Lovecraft's name there, by the way they do it nowadays,
Yeah,
Harry Houdini as told to H.P. Lovecraft or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
Or in some sort of collaborative byline. But when the publisher saw that this story was written in the first person, he says he couldn't wrap his mind around how two people can write a first person narrative. So Lovecraft's name got left off. So it was just by Harry Houdini, and only after Lovecraft's death, Weird Tales reprinted the story and put Lovecraft's name on there and had a little editorial note saying, "Oh yeah, this was actually written by Lovecraft." So, but I actually think it's a very entertaining story and one of his better stories. It sort of leads into the great stories that he would write a couple of years later. Uh, Pretty cosmic in many ways and quite suspenseful and full of entertaining, horrific details.
Well, there's the everybody loves, and I joke around because about this one. Everybody loves to try to shoehorn Lovecraft and Poe really close together. And yes, they were American horror writers and stuff like that, but they're so vastly different in what they write about. And it's so funny, like the Roger Corman movie, The Haunted Palace, and it's Edgar Allan Poe's The Haunted Palace, but it's based on a story by H.P. Lovecraft, and
Mhm.
and I actually got to talk to a director who worked for Roger Corman, and he goes, if Roger could put Poe's name on anything, he would, just because people knew Poe. He goes, people didn't know who Lovecraft was at that point so much, and but then it did, and then I still love that movie to this day. I watch it probably
Oh yeah.
once a year.
Well, yeah. This is 1963, and Lovecraft still was a kind of an unknown quantity. He was, I wouldn't say he was a cult author right then, but he was only published in the small press, chiefly, of course, Arkham House. I mean, he
Yeah,
was getting out there, even some foreign publishers, French publishers that published some of his work, but really he was very little known. So, in the film world, you couldn't get away, saying H.P. Lovecraft's the case of Charles Dexter Ward. That's not going to fly. Nobody's
no,
going to say,
no,
what
not.
is that? Um, and Charles Beaumont, who was a very talented writer in his own right of weird fiction, wrote the screenplay. Uh, I wish they had stuck a little more closely to the story. It's not really a faithful adaptation of Charles Dexter Ward, but yeah, it's certainly entertaining. And that was one of three films that came out, one after the other. That one, Die Monster
Monster
Die with
Die,
Boris Karloff,
and
supposedly an adaptation of Color and Space, very remote from that story. And then The Shutter Room in '65, which well, that's not. I mean, it's kind of Lovecraftian, but it's based on a story that August Derleth wrote that he called a posthumous collaboration with Lovecraft. I'm not sure how you collaborate with somebody posthumously, but let that pass. Um,
Hey, Brian
whatever.
Herbert has made an entire career on.
Well, yes, there is that. But whatever. It just helped to bring Lovecraft to attention. And very soon thereafter, Ballantine Books started publishing Lovecraft in paperback, and they really took off. I'll tell you. Uh, when I was first reading Lovecraft 72, 73, it was like, yeah, I read those Ballantine paperbacks because, although my public library did have the Arkham House editions and I read those too, but I saw these paperbacks out on the shelves and said, yeah, way to go. Lovecraft's getting out there. And
Oh yeah.
then my parents subscribed to Time magazine, and I was sitting there one day in June of 1973, flipping through Time magazine. There was a review of H.P. Lovecraft. I was flabbergasted. Time magazine, Time and Newsweek were like the news magazines of that era. Like, wow, this is Lovecraft's really getting out there. He's starting to rise in both in popularity and to some degree in critical esteem, although that had a long way to go. But yeah, those Ballantine paperbacks, they sold in the millions,
Oh yeah.
and really put Lovecraft on the map as far as popularity is concerned.
Well, the I growing up, yes, I watched like the old, Roger Corman movies, and I didn't quite, I didn't put Lovecraft with them together when I was younger. Probably maybe Night Gallery.
Mm,
Probably Pickman's Model was the first
mm,
one I really remembered being like H.P. Lovecraft on the, on the credit screen. And then I was like, oh, okay. And then, like I said, I was going from Conan, and then I found the Lovecraft, and I was like, oh, okay. And I started reading it, and I started realizing stuff I grew up watching was Lovecraft, because
mm.
I watched it on a Saturday afternoon after cartoons. You got your little horror movies and stuff, and we got the Die Monster Die, the Haunted Palace, Dunwich Horror, and it it was one of the ones where you start putting two and two together because they didn't really put now I grew up in the 80s, then it was like H.P. Lovecraft's The Reanimator, H.P. Lovecraft's From Beyond, H.P. Lovecraft's, and it just kept snowballing. And that's when I really, as a kid, was like, okay, this is something I need to enjoy. And that's when I started finding all the books and going to garage sales and flea markets and buying old Lovecraft books, which was the first ones I started picking up. And then these were the ones that came later with the
Mm.
yeah, that artwork.
Oh yeah, Michael Whalen, superb
Yep.
artwork.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah, the sort of synergy between print and media, especially in the 80s, is fascinating. That really contributed to Lovecraft's rise again in popularity. Hey, I knew Stuart Gordon. He was a great guy. When I first saw Reanimator, I was on the floor laughing. It was funny. I mean, and it was meant to be funny. And in
Yeah.
a weird way, that film is a faithful adaptation of Herbert West Reanimator because the story itself is meant to be kind of an over the top parody. So I said, yeah, way to go, Stuart. That was great. And I enjoyed. And I'll tell you, when Bride of Reanimator came out, that premiered. A lot of people don't know this. It premiered in 1990 at the H.P. Lovecraft Centennial Conference at Brown University, an academic conference which I helped to organize. We had great panelists from some from around the world who had shown up from France and Italy and Germany. A lot of U.S. Scholars and students of Lovecraft. And you go. It was held in a building at Brown University. Go around the corner to the Avon Cinema on Thayer Street in Providence, Rhode Island, and there was Bride of Reanimator on the marquee, and it was great. And again, I was on the floor laughing. It was so funny.
Oh yeah.
Um,
The all three of those movies are so good, and even the Beyond Reanimator, the one that came later, I still
mm,
enjoy it.
yeah, yeah.
Um, I've been lucky enough. I got to talk to Stuart a couple times in my life, and I love Dagon, and it was so funny because I'm sitting there talking to him. I was like, I remember when I went to the video store, and there's the VHS copy of Dagon. And I went, they made a movie out of it's like 5 pages. I mean, how
Yeah.
do you get a movie out of that?
I'll give you some background on that. Stuart, that film came out like in 2001, I
Yeah,
believe. He called me, a year or two ago. Before that, and I said, I want to do the Shadow of Earnsmith, but we're not certain about the copyright status of this story. Um, uh, what do you say we call it Dagon, which is a kind of very early, you might think of it as an early kind of version of, of Shadow of Earnsmith. I said, whatever it takes, guy. Go ahead, be my guest. So I said, fine. That's if that's how you want to do it, go ahead. Um, but it underscores the fact that a number of the major Lovecraft stories, like At the Mountains of Madness, have their roots in these early stories that were, just had the kernel of the idea, but
yeah,
Lovecraft at that time in his career wasn't ready to do the full scale version that he did later on in his life. At the Mountains of Madness really has its kernel in the Nameless City, which actually is a kind of a bad story, frankly. I mean, it's a pretty poor story. But I think Lovecraft said, I, I didn't do enough with this story. There's so much more that can happen. And as he grew intellectually and creatively, by the time he got to 1931, he said, "Yes, I am now ready to write the story that I should have written way back when." And he wrote At the Mountains of Madness. And this happens again. Shadow over Innsmouth, yeah, it has its roots in Dagon. Color Out of Space, the Call of Cthulhu in some ways has its roots in Dagon also, because again, it talks about a land mass rising out of from an earthquake and things like that. The Shadow Out of Time, which also to my mind is his second greatest story after At the Mountains of Madness, had its root in the story called Beyond the Wall of Sleep, which also frankly is a bad story. I mean, it's just bad. But again, the kernel of the idea is there, and it took Lovecraft 15 years to bring it to full fruition.
it's really cool seeing that evolution of his work. Like you said, Dagon. So many books that I've read, they almost always put Dagon into the lead into Shadow over Innsmouth or into the Call of Cthulhu, and it's I think it's a really good publishing idea to take those early stories that have that little nugget and then put them next to the one that was become the fruit that seed bears. They put it
Yeah.
close to them. And I've compared this to listening to like a record because you can listen to stuff streaming and it's all out of order. But when you put a record, you hear it
Mm.
the way it was meant to be listened to. And I think when they put the right editor on the right book, they get the right sequence and it's almost flows perfectly. And a lot
Hmm.
of them early ones do, and it's really nice doing that. So, but it's funny because like I said, I was asking Stuart. I was like, man, I got excited, and then I'm like, how the hell? And then I watched it. I'm like, this is Shadow over Innsmouth, and he's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess we had to bib it a little bit.
Yeah, the story Dagon is in the public domain, therefore he doesn't have to get anybody's permission.
Nope,
Because at that time nobody really knew who owned Lovecraft's rights, if anybody did.
no,
Nowadays it's pretty clear that much of Lovecraft's in the public domain. But he wanted to, he didn't want to pay anybody. I understand that because that takes a lot of your profit margin. So he said, let's call it Dagon. It's nobody can get me for adapting this story, so there it is. Um, I think again, I like Dagon, except maybe the ending. I think it's kind of just I didn't care for the ending, and I still think there's a more faithful adaptation of a lot of these stories that could be made, especially Color Out of Space. There have been what, four adaptations at least. There's
yeah,
there's the Die Monster Dive is terrible. There's a story that film The Curse, which actually isn't bad.
yep,
It's set in the South. I thought that was sort of interesting. And then there's a German film. It's in German. It's called Die Farbe, The Color. Came out like 2011. I thought that was excellent. I think that's one of the best Lovecraft adaptations out there. It's hard to find. You can get it from the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, a DVD. And then, of course, there's Richard Stanley's recent Color Out of Space, which again that was premiered at the Lovecraft Film Festival in Portland, Oregon, which I attend every year. And he was there when this debuted, and I talked to him briefly, and what I should have said was you should have stuck more to the story, guy. I mean, there's so many great scenes in the story, and he just the to my mind, the film loses steam exactly where it departs from the story. So I'm still hoping for again more faithful adaptation. And on this note, I'll tell you, I am in touch with a young director from I think it's Slovakia who, bless his heart, is trying to do a faithful adaptation of At the Mountains of Madness. And he's all need about 5 million, and he thinks he can get $5 million from somewhere, whether the government or private donors. And I've seen some clips of this thing, and this guy, he might just pull it off. I mean, it's a huge challenge to do that story, I'll tell you, but this guy seems to be on track to do it.
Well, you can film a lot, and that's it's what they filmed Dagon in Spain, whatever, Spain or
Mm,
Italy,
yeah.
and you get those tax breaks and you get the money that they bring in, and you also can film stuff cheaper. You can move stuff. They don't have quite the same amount of rules, so people will film overseas and can do a little bit more with a little bit
Yeah.
less. So the
No, it's, I mean, it's all about, you got to get a good screenplay. You got to get, yeah, obviously you have, nowadays the technical side, the special effects things are so much cheaper than they used to be. You don't need a ton of money to get pretty good special effects.
yeah,
So,
well,
yeah.
we were talking about Shadow over Innsmouth. I grew up huge Bernie Wrightson fan. I love
Mm,
Swamp Thing. And I used to belong to the Bernie Wrightson fan club. And if I dig through my stuff, it's packed away. It's probably my storage unit. But I have a binder, and when you open it up, it has his work he did for an early draft of the Shadow over Innsmouth movie that he did all the character sketches for. And I was like, man, that would have been so good to see his work as the creatures, but
mhm.
sadly it never came to fruition. So
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, in my estimation, a lot of the best Lovecraftian films out there are not specific adaptations of actual Lovecraft stories. They're
yeah,
sort of inspired by him or kind of loose adaptations. If you're talking about Shadow Earnsmith, you don't have to go any farther than Mr. Del Toro's The Shape of Water.
yep,
That really is the Shadow over. It's in essence the core of it. I mean, it's a love story, but it's deals with this love between a human woman and a hybrid monster. It won Best Picture. It's a damn good film, but
oh yeah,
the core of it is Shadow of Innsmouth. And uh, there's that film Underwater, which is
yeah.
to my mind Lovecraftian from beginning to end without adapting any specific story.
Oh, I went into that movie because I have a weird fan. I love underwater horror. There's
Mhm.
something about it. It gets me all the time. Me and my wife were sitting in the theater like on a Sunday afternoon, nothing else going on, and when you know shows up, I don't want to give away a movie that's almost 10 years old now. Uh,
Mhm.
uh, at the end, I'm just like, I grabbed my wife's hand. I went, "That's they did it. They did it." And my wife's like, "You're way too excited for this." I'm like, "You don't understand. This is probably one of the best versions of Cthulhu that I've ever
Mhm.
seen, and it's in
Yeah.
a movie that has no Lovecraft, reference until the very, the monsters are there. They're
Right.
underwater monsters, but you don't really until he pops up at the end. You're just like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
that's awesome. Um, um, we were talking on the last interview I did about Carpenter, John
Mhm.
Carpenter, in his versions, and we get the Thing, we get you know uh,
In the Mouth of
in the Mouth of
Madness.
Madness
Yeah.
as a take on In the Mountain, and the other one that people forget is Prince of Darkness,
Mm.
and I didn't, and it was literally after we got done talking, I was like, you know what, I want to watch Prince of Darkness. I sit down and watch it. I forgot the main guy's name is Brian Marsh.
Hmm.
And I went, that is the most Lovecraft hero name. If his
Yeah.
name wasn't Gilman or or something like, and I'm like, and yes, it's cosmic because they reference Jesus was an alien and stuff like that, and I'm like, that is so Lovecraftian, and people don't. didn't see it, and I didn't see it until I was as an adult, and I've watched that movie since it came out in the theater way
Mhm.
too young, and I was like 13 when it came out, I think.
Mhm.
And yeah, it's a lot of the really good Lovecraft stuff is not Lovecraft movies. We talk
Yeah.
about the movie Yellow Brick Road. Have you seen that?
No.
It's about this town that long time ago, the entire town gets up and walks down this road to disappear.
Hmm.
And one person makes it back, and they kind of tell the story of what happens on the road. And well, these group of filmographers come in because they want to go down the road and find out what's at the end of this road. And they slowly start delving into madness. They start seeing things. They start hearing things that may or may not be there. And the director and writer, he's come out and he goes, "Yeah, there is a Lovecraftian monster at the end that you don't get to see, but
Hmm.
it's there. It's
Mhm.
slowly driving these people. They're driven to keep going forward, even though they're all going mad." And I was like, it's stuff like that.
Mhm.
It's these Lovecraft esque movies, I guess you'd
Yeah.
want to refer to
Yeah.
them.
I'll tell you, and even things like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Arthur C. Clarke was profoundly influenced by Lovecraft. In fact, you read his autobiography, Astounding Days, and he says, "Oh my God, when those two Lovecraft serials appeared in Astounding, at the Mouths of Madness and Shadow of Time, I was just blown away." This was 1936. And they stuck in his mind, and you could see it in things like Childhood's End and 2001, which is basically, I mean, the Shadow Out of Time. The core element of that is that these alien species have sort of helped the development of the human race by entering their minds and fostering the development of new inventions and things like that. That is 2001, basically. A very remote connection, but it's definitely there. So yeah, this is how Lovecraft influenced both science fiction and horror fiction after his death is a huge story, and it's still waiting to be told.
Oh yeah, it's I had to explain. I was like, look at Alien and stuff like that.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
very much taken from that.
The
Um,
second Alien film, even more so, I think, than the first one.
oh yeah, because you get to see the walls and the where they the queen and all that stuff starts
Yeah, yeah.
expanding
And
on
of
it.
course, Dan O'Bannon was a great Lovecraft fan.
Mhm.
H.R. Giger, of course, great Lovecraft fan. He did two books of illustrations called Necronomicon. So
Yep.
how how much more Lovecraftian can you get?
Oh yeah. Well, the cool part about growing up and being fascinated by this is I kind of drifted away from the negativity and stuff like that. I enjoy the art for the art's sake, and it's so funny because we joke around that we're slowly the reason that all the Lovecraft stuff is coming back is because the madness that is going on to this day is that the great old ones are coming back eventually, and that he was just the herald, and and that's why we have Cthulhu plushes and kids cartoons and is to prepare us for the coming.
Yeah, I think Lovecraft would be amused and flabbergasted to see how famous he's become over around the world, and also this merchandising. Man, he'd be a very rich man today if
Oh
he could have profited from all this merchandising.
wow!
But hey, it's fine. I mean, if you're a Lovecraft purist, you'll say, "Oh God, we can't have Lulu plush dolls," but I think it's great. It's okay. It gets the stuff out there that keeps him alive, and that's all that an author can ask.
I remember the first time I walked through the video store and there's Howard Lovecraft and like the Kingdom of Ice, and I
Hmm.
went, "What?" I had to walk back, and I'm like, "It's a kids movie." And then I found out there's two more, and now I own them all.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's great. Uh, you know, and I think both of us certainly, and I think almost everybody who reads Lovecraft goes through stages of appreciation. First, when you read him as a teenager, you say, "Oh, these great monsters and all this other stuff." Maybe later on, you say, "Oh, this guy could really write. He had a really complex, richly colored prose style." Some people don't like that prose; it's a little over the top. but I think Lovecraft was a master at the kind of prose that he wanted to write, and I think he did it brilliantly. That's, to my mind, the greatest influence of Poe on Lovecraft is the prose, rather than the conceptions, which really are Lovecraft's own.
Yeah.
Later on, I think even later on, at least for me, Lovecraft himself becomes interesting as an individual in his time. How, all these letters. I mean, 25 volumes of letters out there. That's a lot of letters, and that's only a fraction of what really survived. There are probably 10 times as much that doesn't survive. My God, I'm glad they don't survive because I would never live to edit them all. It would take forever. So the way he responded to events in his time. I mean, he knew about Hemingway, he knew about Faulkner, he knew about Einstein, he knew about FDR and all these things, and his comments on them are really insightful. This guy really was living in the 20th century, even though he might have wanted to live in the 18th century. He was fully aware of what was happening, and he was an extremely interesting commentator. He evolved a very rich, complex philosophy based on atheism, and I wrote a whole book on atheism just recently. And the ultimate inspiration was Lovecraft because I was profoundly convinced of the truth of atheism from reading Lovecraft's letters as in my late teens and early 20s. So he takes you in all these different directions if you let him, because there's so much out there. There's so many facets to him that you don't realize right at the beginning.
Yeah. He was a I'm gonna make this very. He was a very complex man.
Mhm.
I think that's making it as about as simple as possible.
And I hope we all are, but
Oh yeah.
a lot of us don't put it down on paper. I mean, in some ways, writing all these letters, Lovecraft was, in a weird way, the first blogger.
Oh
I mean, this
yeah.
guy, this guy couldn't shut up on paper. I mean, he just couldn't shut up. Some kid like J. Vernon Shea, whom I actually knew later on in life. J. Vernon Shea was like not 18, 19 years old, fan of weird tales. He just wrote Lovecraft a letter and had all these questions, were you married? Were you, blah, 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 blah. And Lovecraft wrote a 20-page handwritten letter back to this guy whom he didn't know from Adam, just because, he was interested and he kept on writing to him another 5 years. I mean, who does that nowadays? I mean,
No.
maybe there are people who do, but, I don't write regular letters anymore. It's too much
No.
effort,
Well,
especially handwritten. I can't handwrite to save my life anymore. I used to, but a long time ago, but not anymore. And thank heaven for email. I'd go. Lovecraft would go broke from. He almost did go broke from writing so many letters, even if they were like only a couple pennies per letter. But
that's
man, he couldn't afford 73 cents a letter these days. Heavens.
no. Well, we had the discussion because we talked last on the last podcast that like he would be a social media nut probably.
Hmm.
He would be, and my buddy pointed out because he goes, all he would probably do is just be on, all the just typing and talking to everybody,
Hmm.
and probably not getting any work done when he should.
Well, yeah, toward the end of his life, he said, I have 97 regular correspondents. Like, oh my God. I mean, some of them were infrequent, like, Robert E. Howard was not all that frequent. But Lovecraft would write 20, 30, 40-page letters back to Howard. And Howard would write the same letters to him, typed. Howard's letters were typed because he didn't like to write by hand, I guess. And he wrote these monster letters back and forth, every couple of months, because they didn't have much time for that. But it's just amazing. And the breadth of his interest, very little didn't interest him. That's the remarkable thing about him.
Yeah, because I mean, he there's always references to the library he grew up in. That
Mhm.
basically his grandfather had that big library where he just studied everything, and but then he was as that disappeared, he moved to the libraries and stuff like that and started studying, and he was a constantly educating himself
Mhm.
and trying to I get better himself and learn more about the world that he wasn't really part of and
Mhm.
wanted to be part of. And it's a lot. He was a constantly learning, constantly educating himself,
Mhm.
even though he was by our terms, because his schooling was very limited, and they would be like, oh, he's uneducated when he was probably one of the most educated people in the area. So,
Absolutely. I mean, hey, this guy was a high school dropout. He
mm,
did not get a high school diploma, and yet he was one of the most educated people of his time. So that should give people, some out there some confidence. You don't have to go to a big Ivy League institution to be considered a smart person. Not at all. I've been to two or three different Ivy League institutions, and there are plenty of stupid people in those institutions. Believe me, there are. There are a lot of smart people too, but that's not the only way you can become educated.
oh,
Self-education in many ways is the way to go. I mean, there are drawbacks to that too. Your education is sometimes a little uneven, whatever. But if you specialize too much in one thing, you miss out on so much else, and that's a big problem today. I think a lot of very educated people tend to focus very narrowly on their field of specialization and not have this broader interest in other things that could really actually help them to become more well-rounded people.
oh yeah, it's one of the ones where I joke around is like when I graduated high school, I started learning because
Hmm.
I was not at school. I'm a well-educated person. I'd like to believe.
Hmm.
I went to college briefly, and it was not for me. I was
Hmm.
not. I couldn't. All I did was butt heads and stuff like that. And as I got older, I just studied. I have books everywhere. Then once the internet, because I'm older than the internet, so I was one of the people who, suddenly like, oh, the world's at my fingertips now. So I started researching and looking things up and becoming more aware and stuff that I would have never learned the way I need to learn in college. And now you know, there's literally probably not one bookshelf in this house that is not covered in books. So,
Oh yeah, and I'll tell you the thing about the libraries that's so important for Lovecraft. I mean, way before the internet, way
mm,
before Google Books. I mean, thank heaven for Google Books, man. I saved me so many trips to the library these days. But they didn't have that privilege back in the 20s. Um, when Lovecraft was in New York, he was so homesick for Providence. He went to the New York Public Library, found a book that had been published, some earlier time. He couldn't check it out of the library because it was in the so-called genealogical reading room. You couldn't check books out of there, so he had to go day after day after day. It was a book called Providence in Colonial Times, and he wrote long letters to his aunt saying, "Oh, this is amazing stuff in this book," and he copied out whole things. What happened is when he got back to Providence, he wrote The Case of Dexter Ward based on that book, essentially. I mean, there are whole passages taken, I wouldn't say literally, but, the nuggets of information are taken right from that book, and you can tell. So libraries help to inspire your imagination. They don't fill your head with knowledge. They can awaken you creatively as well, and that
oh,
happened to Lovecraft over and over again.
believe me, I was a library kid and a library adult growing up and in my early years. It's so bad that everybody that worked at the library knew me.
Yep.
And it was back in the day when you would get books. You had to do interlibrary loaning.
Hmm.
So if you wanted a book that they didn't have, they'd have to go to that, and they'd have to get the library book to ship it to them so that you could read that book. And
Oh, that still happens. I just did that recently for some material that is in the state of Wisconsin, doesn't leave the state of Wisconsin except by interlibrary loan. So through my wife's account at the Seattle Public Library, it came. It was a microfilm. I had incredibly useful for the work I was doing, and spent a week or two at it, and then sent it back. Save me from traveling to the state of Wisconsin. I mean, that's kind of a hike for me.
oh
So
yeah,
it's great. But I keep telling people these days, not everything is on the internet. There are lots of stuff that you have to get through other means, and especially in pursuing Lovecraft and in pursuing you know the intellectual and cultural influences upon him. Some of that stuff is hard to find even now, so you have to make some effort.
see, I ran into when I was younger. When I started running out of Lovecraft, I started moving on to like August Derleth and his,
Hmm.
contemporaries, the people who worked as I like played in the Cthulhu sandbox.
Hmm.
And some of those were so super hard to find, or when I was 14, 15, 16, and now they're much easier because now you have like anthology books and stuff like that has or collections, I should say. Um, but yeah, you really got to look. I mean, I've got my wife and my best friend always tell me like, why do you buy so many books? Everything's online. I'm like, man, it's not.
Oh, for my, for when I was compiling a Lovecraft bibliography back in, well, first in '81, and then did a revised edition decades later. I had to travel to the British Library, formerly known as the British Museum, in London, to find one of these so-called amateur periodicals that was published in England, only available there. Literally the only copy that, at least in public hands. I mean, maybe some private individual had it, but I wouldn't know that. Had to go there, and because that stuff was not digitized. Hey, British Museum is digitizing a lot of stuff, but not that one. So yeah, it's amazing. Speaking of digitization, by the way, Brown University, my God, let's all take our hats off to them. They have digitized the entire Lovecraft collection. Every page of Lovecraft's manuscripts, and also all the other stuff like letters he received from people, tens of thousands of pages available. Look at something called the Brown Digital Repository and the Howard P. Lovecraft Collection. You can look at every single page there. Incredibly great reproduction. So
Nice.
nobody has to go to the library anymore to look at that stuff. It's all out there.
Oh, go look it up online. Well, if you would have told me growing up after reading Lovecraft and doing all this stuff, and like I said, I've joked around that there's kids movies, now there's video games, now there's role playing games, now there's these toys, now they're appearing he's in Rick and Morty. Uh, I as a I never thought it would be mainstream ever in my entire life. I always
Mhm.
thought he would be um, on the cusp, like, your mainstream guy, this is what he likes.
Mhm.
Like Stephen King, Clive
Yeah.
Barker. They've all read Lovecraft, and that's how they got their work. And now I'm just like, I never in a million years thought this would happen.
Well, yeah, and as I say, I'm even a little older than you, if I may say so. uh, especially in the late '60s, early '70s, Lovecraft was sort of becoming popular, but it was still, I mean, nobody really heard of him out there in the general community. Certainly not the academic community. Very, very small number of academics were interested in Lovecraft. Um, when I was growing up, almost nobody around me read Lovecraft. So it was almost like you were belonged in a secret society, and
Yep.
in some ways I kind of miss that. It's like this is our guy. Nobody else knows about him, and nobody else should know about him. But actually, it's great that he's out there, and so many people are to this day continually affected by his work. This guy wrote 100 years ago. Not a lot of people from 100 years ago, especially from that pulp era, have lasted this young. Robert E. Howard has, not a whole lot of others. Um, and especially the worldwide influence that he's had. And it's not just in literature, it's in film, it's in television, it's in comic books, even in philosophy, believe it or not. There's a guy named Graham Harman who wrote a book called Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy. Very learned, scholarly work. He claims that Lovecraft has helped him form a new philosophical movement. Okay, fine. I don't know what that is exactly, but good for him. Whatever. It's just amazing. As I say, Lovecraft will be completely flabbergasted because it's so sad. I mean, this guy lived 46 and a half years, died in poverty, and I'm sure on his deathbed he was saying, oh, yeah, my work's all going to be forgotten. It just published in these crumbling pulp magazines. Nobody cares. I never got a book published in my whole life. It's all going to be, for naught. I've lived a useless life. But no, his friends, including Derleth, rescued his work, got it published with Archipows, and then it went on from there and just snowballed. And I like to think I've had some effort in getting it out there through my editions with Penguin Classics and stuff like that. But Lovecraft is now the property of the world. He doesn't belong to anybody. He's out there.
Well, it's good or bad. It's something I think everybody needs, because I've talked about existential dread and people like, oh man, I'd love to live forever, or this, that, and other. And Lovecraft has convinced me that living forever is something that I would never, ever, ever want to do.
Yes.
And I was like, I want to fill my time out here in this world and be done with it. I
Yeah.
do not want to live forever.
You
Uh,
know, even the so supposedly bad sides of Lovecraft. Let's be honest, the racism is a bad
oh
thing.
yeah,
We can go into that in terms of historical influence and stuff like that. There are ways to portray Lovecraft's racism as not quite as horrible as it seems. But the mere fact that today, 100 years after the fact, that people are still getting so hot and bothered about it, in a strange way, shows how important Lovecraft is.
yeah,
That this issue matters to us. That he matters to us. We don't get all hot and bothered about the fact that Jack London was ferociously anti-Asian. I mean,
yeah.
he wrote an essay called "The Yellow Peril," or that H.G. Wells had it in for the so-called primitive societies, or even that George Orwell was a homophobe, stuff like that. This doesn't freak people out the way it seems to freak out people about Lovecraft. And I think that's unfair to some degree because
Oh
you
yeah.
got to judge Lovecraft by the views of his contemporaries and by of his time, but it shows again how deeply invested people are in Lovecraft that it affects them so much.
We discussed that a couple weeks back. I go, I grew up reading, Lovecraft and stuff, Conan, but I also read Burroughs. I also read, the pulp, like Doc Savage and The Shadow and, you know, um, the Spider. And we joked around. I was like, yeah, I've read the collected editions where they cut out all the racism, so they're like 8 pages long now. And I was like, but people don't really. It's Lovecraft is and then but these guys get a pass, kind
Yeah.
of. And I'm like, no, they're pretty not good people either.
Mhm. But again, you have to be very careful passing moral judgments on people in the past
Oh yeah,
because
because it was a different
you
world.
got to have a
Yeah.
perspective. I mean, I always say in 50 or 100 years, what are they going to criticize us for? You know, you
Oh
got to keep that in mind. We do things that people in 100 years will say, "My God, how could they done those horrible things?" So let's be a little humble about this passing this kind of judgment.
oh yeah. It's I joke around. I was like, yeah, I have a Lovecraft esque tattoo. And everybody's like, yeah, Lovecraft is like, nah, I ain't got a Lovecraft tattoo. I got a page of the Necronomicon tattooed on my arm.
Hmm.
And they're like, I was like, I don't want to put that dude's face on me. All right, we'll just leave it at that. Um, but it's Lovecraft is complex. He's very much a product of of two times. He was a product of the 20s and the teens, the 20s and early 30s. But he believed he was a product of the 18, 17, 1800s. And you're just you look at that and you're like, yeah, that completely makes sense on the way people were
But
back then.
and yet, in another way, Lovecraft is very timeless,
Yeah.
and that's why he affects people so much. This idea of cosmic insignificance really is his signature contribution to literature.
Mhm.
That is not bound, to his era. In fact, that's because it is a universal sensation. Because we are living in a time when religion, be frank about it, has lost its influence. We feel alone in the universe, and Lovecraft captured that sense of insignificance in a way that no writer ever has, and frankly may never in the
No.
future. And that's why he's so relevant today because he speaks to us in a way that a lot of the other writing from that era, even the famous writing like Sinclair Lewis or whoever, doesn't speak to us because it's in some ways more rooted in the culture of its time than Lovecraft was. In that sense, Lovecraft benefited from being sort of apart from times in which he lived. He had that cosmic perspective that went all the way back to classical antiquity. He loved ancient Greece and Rome, but even beyond that, his scientific researches took him all the way back to the dawn of the universe, and he filtered all that through into fiction that is so artfully done that it still has an incredible impact. 100 years after his death.
Lovecraft's how I discovered the concept of deep time.
Mm.
And I never, it wasn't until I really got older and I started realizing, like, oh, so yeah, okay, so I learned this way back from reading Lovecraft, and now it's something I'm like learning in like an actual, you know, textbook. So, but like I said, Lovecraft is a very complex man with complex issues that has basically made, in my beliefs, horror essentially what it is today.
Hmm.
I don't think, if there was a Lovecraft, do I think there would have been a Stephen King? Maybe. Would it be the Stephen King we know? No. You
No.
know, and a lot of authors have taken the whole concept of what he's done, made it their own, tweaked it, but still kind of references it. And because we got stuff like Lovecraft Country, and then I think one of the earliest non-core group Lovecraft-esque stories I ever read was from Clive Barker,
Hmm.
and that was a gay British man, and you're like, it's
Well,
what he's
well,
got to do.
actually, in terms of Lovecraft's influence, I would point to somebody like Ramsey Campbell, who doesn't get the
Yeah,
press that he deserves, but to my mind, he is like the great writer of weird fiction of our time, and he has been profoundly influenced by Lovecraft. His first volume was basically, which he wrote as a teenager, was basically a set of Lovecraft pastiches, which were good in their way, but nothing like what he wrote later on. But
yep,
even the stuff he wrote later, which is really profound and meaningful, has that core of Lovecraft's influence, and he took from it the notion of that of Lovecraft's artistry, not just the concepts, but the way Lovecraft crafted a story for maximum impact. Lovecraft doesn't get enough credit for being a good writer of what I call story construction, going from the first word to the last, and just building up the suspense and the power word by word by word. It's a masterful way of doing it. Other writers like T.E.D. Klein, whom I knew very well, Ted Klein, great writer, still living in New York, and profoundly influenced by Lovecraft. He wrote an honors thesis on Lovecraft at Brown University. Caitlin Kiernan, to this day, acknowledges the influence of Lovecraft, and she's appeared on some of these documentaries. Um, you know, these writers who don't get quite the attention of King and Barker show the real influence of Lovecraft even more than they do.
yeah, because as a comic book fan, you got Bernie Wrightson and Lynn Wein and Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman and uh, Garth Ennis. You got these guys who take and they've made, a lot of people don't. Batman. A lot
Hmm.
of Batman has Arkham
Yep,
Asylum. It's all
you bet.
references there. Shuma Gorath from Conan and Doctor Strange, and
Mhm.
it's deep ingrained into our lives, and people may not know it, but he is. There's probably a reference that I knew people that had no idea Lovecraft, and then they watched True Detective,
Mhm.
and they're like, "Do you know anything about it?" It's like, "Yes, I do. Let me explain it to you."
Yeah, and
Okay,
nowadays these Lovecraft references appear, without explanation, and you are expected to know what they are. For example, I
yeah,
was watching this great recent TV show called Endeavor, which is about a British detective guy, in Oxford. And in one case, he's interviewing an elderly couple from Massachusetts, and they say, "Yeah, we're from Kingsport." Like, what? Did I just hear that? I couldn't believe it, and that's all it is. And it goes. The very next episode deals with an artist named Pickman. Gee, that's even more obvious. But you're just expected to know what the references are. If you don't, well, then you're culturally illiterate. So Lovecraft has become part of the conversation in this sort of thing. It's wonderful.
yeah. It's something that as the 13-year-old Paul would have never thought this would be the way it is. I wouldn't think that I would have more than just a handful of old beat up paperbacks, and now I have stacks of new Lovecraft esque stories from different writers and comic books and now video games and cartoons and movies and I remember when you would tear through the video store and you try to find a new Lovecraft movie or and now you can go on any streaming network and somebody has a new Lovecraft-esque movie up and you look at the list on IMDb and there's always one in production and you're
Mhm.
just like, I never thought this would be a life that I would be able to continue on. My kids like Lovecraft, and we talk about the negative stuff, but we joke around about that. But we talk serious about the writing. We joke about the other stuff.
And there are two things about that. Every year, as I say, in I think first weekend of October, the HP Lovecraft Film Festival in Portland, Oregon. Great, it's really interesting material there. Both from independent producers and some professional films. Always entertaining, always interesting to see what the filmmakers out there are doing. But the other thing is, Lovecraft is a worldwide phenomenon. He has been translated into 30, 35 languages, French, all the European languages, all the Asian languages. The Chinese have really embraced Lovecraft. In fact, they're not only translated Lovecraft, they're now translating my biography. I'm very flattered at that. The Russians have translated Lovecraft. Some of them were way early on were pirated editions. They did that all the time, but now they're more legitimate now. He's in Turkish, he's in Serbo-Croatian. There are Lovecraft editions in Arabic. Believe it or not. Yeah, that's great. There
I,
are Lovecraft editions in Hebrew, which is fantastic.
I'm waiting
So
for the Lovecraft Klingon editions.
that's right. It's
That's it.
amazing. I mean,
They,
as I say, I hear from people all the time overseas, who say, "Hey, I want to translate Lovecraft. What should I do? How do I go about getting the best text and things like that?" It's the appetite appears to be insatiable. They just do edition after edition after edition. It's amazing.
oh, yeah. It's I'm I get probably a new. I would say I probably get a new Lovecraft book every year.
Mhm.
And yes, some of it's repeat stuff, some of it's not, some of it's got new people working on in playing in the sandbox. But I've got stacks and stacks of the Lovecraft esque books and the Cthulhu mythos and just it's something that I will probably never stop reading, and I hope I never do.
Mhm.
Uh, and I will never stop looking for the movies. I'll never stop looking for the comics. And I'll always hope, fingers crossed, that one day Guillermo del Toro will get the money together to make it at the Mountains of Madness. Uh,
We'll see about that. Yeah, or something else. I mean, oh, it's funny. I think Del Toro is kind of a schizophrenic director in the sense that he does these really artful films like Shape of Water and Pan's Labyrinth that are just superb. They're like Fellini. On the other hand, then he does the popular stuff like Hellboy, which is entertaining in its own right, but it's a very different kind of work.
yeah,
I hope that if he ever gets to Lovecraft, he does the more artistic kind rather than just bunch of monsters and things. But who knows? Or maybe a mix. It's.
well, we
I
got
would love to see a director. I think you mentioned this sort of. Love to see a director do a Lovecraft film and not show the monster at all.
yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if people have the restraint to do that, and whether the audience will accept something like that. But it would be a challenge to do, and I think it might be worth doing.
I think it's Yellow Brick Road. I think that's why that movie
Mm,
works, is because you
yeah.
never see the monster. It's all madness and people driven. Um, and a lot of people, I remember when it first came up, everybody's like, this is dumb, this is dumb. And now it's got this like resurgence of people who've like went back and rewatched it and now they kind of get it now. And it's like, see, I told you it was a good movie. But I'm also that guy who is every horror movie that now has become hugely popular. I'm the same guy going, see, I told you it was a really good movie the entire time. Uh, but I don't want to keep it too much longer. We've already gone over an hour, but
Mm.
I greatly appreciate this, sir. I could talk to you for hours.
Yeah.
Just talk
Yeah.
Lovecraft. Um, so do you have any upcoming projects you're currently working on or anything?
Well, I can mention one thing. I read this huge biography of Lovecraft a while back. Now, I won't go into the story, but I am now writing a biography of Clark Ashton Smith. It's long overdue, and I think I have a lot of the research that I need. In fact, I just spent a week in Providence, Rhode Island, because they had the Clark Ashton Smith papers there also at the Brown University Library, and I looked through all this stuff. And I think now I'm getting to the point where I can get together a reasonably good biography. It won't be huge because there's just not enough documentary evidence for certain aspects of Smith's life. He didn't write millions of letters the way Lovecraft did. But I think it's important to get it out there because Smith is a really interesting writer in his own right, and as a poet, as a fiction writer, even as an artist, he was a painter, a sculptor, did all this stuff. A very, very, he certainly a very complex individual. So that's my main focus right now. Should be done this year, published next year.
And where can people find you online at?
Oh, I have a sorry, I have a website, stjoshi.org. I do not do social media because A, it's just a time waster. I'm sorry. It's
Mhm.
just I don't have the time. I mean, literally my whole day is full of work, and I don't have the time to chat on social media. But I always respond to emails. You can drop me an email through my website, and I'm usually able to respond. But you can hear my doings on that website.
And from an expert, where would you tell people to start reading Lovecraft at?
Well, not to be immodest, but I think the first of my Penguin books, The Call of Cthulhu and Other Stories, I think it was meant to be kind of an introduction to the best of Lovecraft. I mean, you can't get all of Lovecraft in all of the best of Lovecraft in one volume. So then I did two other volumes. So you read that first one, and then you can read two other ones. And I like to think a lot of people have said that my annotations of the stories were helpful to people to study the background and certain of the details in those stories. So I think there are not that many annotated editions of Lovecraft out there. So I think that might be a good place to start.
And can people buy? Where can people buy your product?
Well, most of my stuff these days is done with Hippocampus Press. Fine publisher out of New York, small press, but they've done a lot of good books of various sorts. I've done a lot of stuff for them. In fact, we have published quite literally every single word that Lovecraft ever wrote. Almost. 4 volumes of fiction, including the collaborations, 1 big volume of poetry, 5 volumes of essays, and now 25 volumes of letters. The last one not quite out yet, but it will be in a month or two. So literally every word of Lovecraft is out there in good editions, I hope, from Hippocampus Press.
Now, the last question: do you believe that there is like a something like a love something Lovecraft left behind that people just don't know about yet, or somebody might have? Do you think that there's
Oh
more
God, yeah,
letters that
there
maybe
are
somebody?
letters out there. I know they're in private hands that have not been made available to me, and I hope you collectors out there think about that and drop me a line because frankly, these documents should be made public. I mean, they shouldn't be in the hands of private individuals. I have a moral objection to the ownership of manuscripts in private hands because by definition a manuscript is a unique item, nobody else can get it, but it deserves. Lovecraft is such a public figure, it has to be out there for scholarship, for whatever reason. So there are documents out there, and I hope they are made available sometime.
Even if they don't get them to you, at least scan them and get
Just
them
give me
out
a
there.
scan, that'll be fine.
Yeah,
And we'll publish yet another volume of Lovecraft's letters if we have enough of them.
there we go. So, well, sir, I greatly appreciate this. Like I said, I've been waiting for this all week. Because, like I said, I could go on forever, and I
Yeah,
got to kind
sure.
of rein myself in, or if not, I will just be
Well,
talking.
we can do another one sometime.
Yeah. So, I will appreciate it.